All right, today's lesson, we are continuing our walk through the Bible. And we are going. So last week we talked about Isaac. He was Abraham's son. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, but Isaac was the one that God's covenant was chosen to go through. And Isaac grows up. So last week he was like a kid, probably somewhere between 10 and 13. And this week he's grown up, and Abraham starts thinking, didn't God promise I'd be the father of many nations? And for that to happen, my son needs to get married. And so he's like, I think it's time for my son to settle down and get a wife. So if you'll remember, Abraham is living in Canaan, which will later become Israel. But at this time, there's a bunch of Canaanites living in Israel. Canaanites, they were people like anybody else, but they didn't follow God, right? They had different gods and stuff. Some of the area was pretty bad, what we'd refer to as godless, but of course they were all godless because they didn't follow God. But I mean, the things they did were pretty morally reprehensible. There's a pretty famous story, right, of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham's nephew moves to one of those cities, and some angels show up to see if the city is worth saving. And while they're there, Lot's family is the only family that shows them hospitality. And hospitality back then was a really big deal because there were no hotels or anything like that. So if you were traveling, you kind of relied on the hospitality of people. But so Lot's family offers these angels hospitality. They don't know they're angels. And the rest of the city offers them violence. They basically want to murder the angels. And so God lets Lot's family flee the city, but then God destroys the city with fire from heaven. So, if your city's getting to the point where God just straight up destroys you with fire from heaven, that's pretty bad. And so, but mostly it's that they don't follow God, right? And Abraham doesn't want his son, even if they find a nice girl who's not like terrible person, she wouldn't be following God, and he doesn't really want his son to be like led astray. So he wants his son to marry somebody who also comes from a family that follows God. So preferably from amongst his family, like a cousin or a second cousin, which today is really weird, right? Marrying your cousin, don't do it. There are some places where you can still even today marry your cousin. But the reason why today we frown upon marrying relatives is not just it's creepy icky, which it is, but there's like genetic reasons for that, right? Because there's this concept of recessive genes. So dominant genes are almost always gonna be what you have, right? Brown hair is a dominant gene. If, your parents have the gene for brown hair, you are most likely to have brown hair. Blonde hair is a recessive gene. So to get blonde hair, both of your parents have to carry the blonde hair recessive gene. So that can happen a couple of ways. Both of your parents can have brown hair and the blonde hair recessive gene. One of your parents can have brown hair and the other can have blonde hair, and then you're more likely to have blonde hair. And blonde hair is nice. That's not a concern. The problem with recessive genes is there's actually a lot of really bad stuff in our recessive genes. A more benign example would be color blindness, right? Color blindness is not the end of the world, but, if your dad is colorblind, and your mom has the colorblind recessive gene, then all your kids are basically going to be colorblind. Not necessarily. Your daughters may not be colorblind. That's one of those weird genes that are carried on the X and Y chromosomes. but there's a lot of like bad things that are carried in recessive genes. So this is how like we had some British kings in history who were literally insane, and that's because they intermarried too much, and so all those recessive genes came to the front, right? So people who intermarry are more likely to have genetic abnormalities. So that is why today we frown upon intermarrying. But back then, they didn't know anything about genetics. They didn't really care. Possibly not as much a concern, because, you know, the population was still so new. Maybe there wasn't as much bad genetics out there. But yes. So Abraham wants to find someone from his family for Isaac to marry. Abraham had some other brothers. They had kids. You know, if we go to our family tree, so there's Abraham, but he had this brother Nahor, and he had this brother Haran. Now Haran's kid was Lot, and Lot came with Abraham, but Nahor had some other kids. And so he's like, why don't you go find a wife amongst my people? So, but Abraham doesn't want to travel all the way back, so he sends a servant all the way back. And that's where we're going to pick up, is Genesis 24, 10 through 14. This would have been a long trip. This trip would have been no joke either, right? So Genesis 24, 10 through 14. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts from his master, and set out and went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water. It was towards evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I shall say, please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. So says he goes to the city of Nahor. We already talked about Nahor is the name of one of Abraham's brothers. So that's probably like the place where Nahor lives. It's probably not a city like we think of a city, but it probably is a settlement. Remember, Abraham and his family were very, very wealthy. So they didn't travel lightly, and they had lots of servants, slaves, and people associated with them. So, you know, it is not without thought. It's probably like this place where Nahor lives, that is just like where all of his people, and he's the richest guy there, right? So odds are that somebody that he finds there could be related to Nahor, but they would definitely be of Nahor's house. So they might be not necessarily like a kid of Nahor, but a servant or whatever. So this servant is like, how am I going to figure out amongst all of these women who come to get water from the well, which one God wants me to bring back? This is a pretty big decision to put on a servant who's probably a slave, let's be honest. And if he makes the wrong decision, this is a huge trip to make to pick the wrong person, right? So he's just like, oh my gosh, I need to pick the right one, right? So as we talked about a little bit earlier, hospitality back then was a big deal. So this servant guy is not crazy for asking these women to draw water for him. That would be part of the normal hospitality ethics of the time. If a stranger asked you for water, you would be honor bound to provide it. However, she would not be required to provide water for the animals. Basically, the servant is looking for God to point him to a girl who has a kind heart, who's willing to go the extra mile for a stranger, and hoping that God will allow that girl to be Isaac's wife, who he's supposed to bring home from her. So he just like prays to God, and he's like, please God, help me find this girl who's going to be awesome and go the extra mile, and that should be the one for Isaac. And so Abraham won't be mad at me. So let's see what happens. So Genesis 24, 15 through 20. Before he had finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. The girl was very fair to look upon, a virgin whom no man had known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please let me sip a little water from your jar. "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well and drew for all his animals. So bingo, this is the girl, right? It says she was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother. So in this chain, that means she is a child of this person, which I forgot to put here, but whatever. So she is Abraham's great niece. Yeah, that seems right. So she's not Isaac's first cousin. She's kind of Isaac's first cousin once removed, I think is how that works. The servant doesn't know that she is related to all these people. He just knows that this is what he prayed to God for, and that this is what he wanted to happen. So he's like, she is the girl. So Genesis 24, 23 through 28. So this is the servant. The servant said, "Tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." She added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night." The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on my way to the house of my master's kin." Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. So she confirms she is indeed of the family of Abraham, which is what Abraham wanted, right? And offers him a place to stay. And what does the servant immediately do? He immediately praises God. And what does she do? She runs home to tell her family. Not that she knows that she's supposed to be getting married from this yet. She just is like, this guy is from like our uncle Abraham. We should welcome him in. So Rebekah has a dad and a brother who are still alive. And basically, as soon as Rebekah brings this servant there, they offer him hospitality. But the servant immediately wants to get to business and explain this whole situation. How Abraham sent him to find a bride for his son Isaac, and how the servant thinks Rebekah is that bride. Now, back then, Rebekah's dad and brother, her brother is named Laban. That's important. You need to remember that. That's going to come back later. Laban, they would have been perfectly in their rights to make this decision without consulting Rebekah. We've talked about this before, that women were basically viewed as property. Rebekah has no choice in what happens to her. Her dad has the ultimate choice. If her dad is older and kind of failing, then a lot of that choice could fall to her brother. Basically they do tentatively agree with the servant upon hearing the story, because they are not about to go against what is clearly God's will. But we're going to read how that goes down exactly. So we're going to go to Genesis 24, 54 through 61. Genesis 24, 54 through 61. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they rose in the morning, he said, "Send me back to my master." Her brother and her mother said, "Let the girl remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go." But he said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has made my journey successful. Let me go, that I may go to my master." They said, "We will call the girl and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will." So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes." Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. So Rebekah's family agrees she should go off and marry Isaac, but they ask for 10 days, probably 10 days of goodbyes. Maybe you prepare some stuff for her new life. Because remember, she's not just like moving down the street. She is moving so far away that she will probably never see them again. So they want this time, right? They just want 10 days is what they ask for. We would think, well, that's not very much. Sure, 10 days. But the servant's like, "Nope, I got to go now. I found a girl. I got to go back. Peace." Right? The family is hesitant because it's super far away. And they're basically marrying their daughter off to somebody who, from their perspective, lives on Mars. It's some place that is so far away, they're never going to go there. And so while they're okay with her going, they still want this time. But they're like, well, we'll ask Rebekah, which is not something they have to do. They don't have to ask her, but they're going to. Now, if you were Rebekah, how would you feel about this? You're going to go off with a strange servant who claims to be a servant of a grand uncle you've never met to marry a guy you've never met. Would you be willing to do this? I wouldn't. I'd be like, this is crazy, right? Like, no, I'm not going off with this strange man who claims to be from our uncle just because he showed up with a lot of gifts. That just seems like a bad idea. But Rebekah says she is willing to go. She seems to realize this is God's will and knows that sometimes God asks us to do stuff that doesn't always seem fun, like move far away from your family. But she's willing to do it because she knows that's what God has asked of her. So this is a large amount of faith from Rebekah to do this. So she's like, I'm going to trust God. She is like Abraham before her, right? When God told Abraham to move, except Abraham got to move with all of his people. Rebekah gets to take some stuff and some maids, but not her brother, not her mom. She's basically going alone. So in a lot of ways, she's a lot braver than Abraham is. So her family quickly says goodbye. And they send her with a nurse and some maids, like I said. So, needless to say, when Rebekah gets all the way back to Canaan, she and Isaac get married. That's the whole purpose of her going there. The whole purpose of her going there is to get married and have kids. So eventually she does, in fact, get pregnant, though it does actually take them a fairly long time. So, family tree. So Rebekah marries Isaac, though remember, she also comes from over here. So I should have fixed that, make it more, I'll fix it later. But she is descended from this person, and now she's marrying Isaac. So, yeah, it's weird. Next section is Genesis 25, 24 through 28. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle. So they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, living in the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. All right, we're getting to some more wonderful family favoritism, which is never something I recommend to make it clear that you love one of your children more than the other. So Rebekah gives birth to twins. Fun fact, this is the first set of twins in the Bible, but not the only set. But there's a lot going down here, so we need to break it down. First off, her first kid, who they named Esau, is described as red and hairy. You're probably like, red and hairy. Today, it's not like super desirable to be very hairy, right? This is why, women shave their legs, men shave their faces, But when the Bible describes someone as red, first off, what they're saying is a ruddy complexion, which is synonymous with a healthy complexion. They're not trying to say he had red skin or make some sort of racist comment about Esau, right? They're trying to say that he was healthy. He had a healthy complexion. The same word is used to describe King David in Samuel. So it could also mean handsome. Red could mean healthy, handsome. It's a desirable way to be. Hairy as well was not necessarily derogatory, for hair growth was valued as a sign of health. People who had lots of hair were very healthy. So really they're saying that Esau was a very beautiful and healthy child. And then we have Jacob. So it says, afterward his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So what does that mean? this is more than just a baby being born grabbing another baby's heel, which I'm pretty sure is impossible. But it could have happened. But I'm pretty sure it's impossible. Really what this is about, the grabbing of the heel, it's an omen. It's foreshadowing. It's making a statement about the brothers' relationship to each other. So whether he was born literally grabbing his heel, or whether this is a metaphor, not a metaphor, whether this is a metaphor, right? For their whole relationship from the time they were born. Jacob was grabbing Esau's heel. What they would mean by that is that Jacob from the beginning is attempting to supersede Esau. Grabbing the heel could also convey the idea of deception, betrayal, and opportunism. It's used in the Bible to indicate a trusted friend's deception, which we see in Psalm 41:9. So let me flip forward there. Even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me. So the symbol of the heel, it doesn't have to be literal. It could just symbolize that from the day they were born, Jacob wanted to be the oldest. Because what's important about being the oldest? The oldest gets everything, right? This is a culture that follows old school primogeniture, which means that the oldest son inherits everything. Now, we've already seen that turned on its head, right? Because Ishmael was the oldest son. But to keep Ishmael from inheriting everything, Abraham basically exiled Ishmael so that Isaac could be his only heir. So now we have Jacob and Esau. Esau is clearly the oldest. He was born first, and we are showing that from the moment they were born, Jacob is displeased with this relationship, that he wishes he had been born first. We also see that we're talking about Rebekah, right? We're not supposed to be talking about Jacob and Esau, but this is all related, right? Because Isaac loves Esau. Rebekah loves Jacob. Favoritism is bad. Parents aren't supposed to have favorites. Some of you are only kids, so you are your parents only. But some of you live in families with lots of kids, and maybe you feel like sometimes one of them is the favorite. In this scenario, we clearly have two kids where one parent has picked one and one parent has picked the other. What I think is also really interesting here is that Esau is very characterized as what would have been considered very masculine during that time period, a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Esau's like the jock football player, right? And Jacob is a quiet man living in the tents, which is what the women did. The women lived in the tents. And we're going to see this again and again, that Jacob is kind of described in what we would consider, and what they would consider, feminine terms. But God doesn't condemn Jacob for his femininity. So sometimes it's our culture that puts these things on us. Gender roles aren't always as straightforward as we like to think. But regardless, Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. This is not going to work out well. So we have Jacob, we have Esau. Continuing on to Genesis 27, 1 through 4. That's just repeating those verses we already looked at. Genesis 27, 1 through 4. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called his elder son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "See, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapon, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food, such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I might bless you before I die." Okay, so Isaac is old, basically going blind. Sorry, my throat hurts a little bit. A little more tea. There's not much left. The tea is empty. He's old. He's going blind. I mean, probably cataracts, right? They didn't have cataract surgery back then. If not, just his eyes failing him in general. And so since he knows he might die soon, he basically wants to give his blessing to his oldest and favorite son. So what is a blessing? I looked through the whole internet and my commentary and read all the footnotes in my Bible, and I'm still not entirely sure. What I do know is that it's not quite the birthright or inheritance, because we're going to talk about that later. But it's probably something more spiritual, more to do with passing down Abraham's legacy from Isaac to one of the sons. Just like Abraham's legacy of being God's chosen people only went to Isaac and not Ishmael, it seems like the blessing might be Isaac choosing which of his sons is the chosen one through which God's covenant would continue. Now, why did he only have to bless one of them? Why couldn't he have blessed both of them? Y'all, I don't know. We know that Jacob later blesses all of his sons, of which he has 12. That God's covenant goes through all 12 of Jacob's sons. So why couldn't Isaac bless both of his sons? Why couldn't we, instead of having 12 tribes of Israel, have the 2 tribes of Isaac? I don't know. It's 12 tribes of Israel because Jacob is Israel, which we'll get to later. Maybe Isaac didn't know he could split up the blessing. Maybe God told him he could only choose one. Maybe he just liked Esau so much more than Jacob that he was like, I'm going to cut Jacob out of this. Kick him out. I don't like Jacob. I don't know. I literally don't know. But this is the way the story goes. In the story, he thinks or chooses to only pick one. And so, of course, he picks his favorite, Esau. All right, next verse. Genesis 27, 5 through 10. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father say to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I might bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and get me 2 choice kids, so that I may prepare for them from a savory food for your father, such as he likes, and you shall take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. First off, a kid is a baby goat, just so that's clear. They're not killing children. They're killing baby goats. All right, so Rebekah hears what Isaac is going to do. And since Jacob is her favorite son, if she gets to choose who the Abrahamic tradition goes to, of course she's going to choose Jacob. So she concocts a plan. She's basically going to have Jacob pretend to be Esau and steal the blessing from his brother. This, you guys, is a huge coup, right? Like huge. Rachel. Rebekah is basically going behind her husband's back to do what she thinks is right without talking to him. Now, rabbinic tradition, that means Jewish tradition, holds that Rebekah, being not blind and as old as Isaac, saw more than he did. That Isaac's blindness was not just literal, but also metaphorical, and that he was blind to Esau's faults. That Esau was in fact wicked, and she saw that. But the Bible doesn't really tell us that. All we really know about Esau is that he's a bit of a jock, likes to go hunting, and is a strong man, and that he's a bit of a temper on him. Regardless, Jacob was Rebekah's favorite son, and she made a decision here. A decision that affects the future irrevocably, for good or for ill. It's Rebekah who saves Jacob when his father and brother hear what happened. And we're going to look at this later more from Jacob's perspective, but right now we're really focusing on Rebekah, right? So basically Jacob gets the blessing from Isaac, who remember is old and blind and can't really tell. And when Esau comes home and reveals that he never got a blessing, that makes Isaac realize what happened. And so they're both furious. They are so angry. So Genesis 27, 41 through 45. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. But the words of her elder son Esau were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him for a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger against you turns away, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day? So I told you Laban was going to come back, right? So Rebekah sends Jacob away to her brother Laban, thereby saving Jacob's life. Because Esau is like, I'm going to wait till dad dies and then I'm going to murder you. Cool. Waiting till his father dies because, generally fathers frown upon it when sons kill each other. So we're going to see next week what's going to happen to Jacob when he leaves. But this week we are focusing on Rebekah. And I could have looked at the story from Isaac's perspective or Rebekah's. And I chose Rebekah because even though it was Isaac who was the son of Abraham, who God's covenant went to, it was Rebekah who determined the future of all of the Hebrew people. Rebekah, who through her faithfulness followed a strange man to a strange land to marry a stranger. Rebekah, who took her children's destiny into her own hands, not letting a man make the determination for her, for good or for ill. So, I've told you guys this before, but when I grew up, people looked at this story very patriarchally, and they were like, well, Rebekah was clearly wrong. She went against her husband. How dare she? But if we go by the idea of Scripture should interpret Scripture, which means we should look at the Bible and other places in the Bible to figure out what we should think of other parts of the Bible, we actually see that Rebekah's decision is a good decision. Paul talks about this in Romans and says that Rebekah's decision here was what God would have, is the way God wanted to have it. So let's flip forward to Romans 9:10 through 14. Romans 9:10 through 14. So this is Paul writing basically about this story. Nor is that all. Something similar happened to Rebekah when she had conceived children by one husband, our ancestor Isaac, even before they had been born or had done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose of election might continue, not by works, but by his call. She was told, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau. What then are we to say? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. So there's some weird stuff in here about, loving Jacob, hating Esau. I don't think God actually hated Esau. But what Paul is saying here is that this is all God's design. Do we really think that one woman thwarted God's entire plan for all the Hebrew people in Israel and the Jewish people to this day? That one woman had the power to be like, oh, God wanted Esau to have the blessing, so throw that out. And I'm going to, do what I want, and God's plan is thwarted. Seems unlikely. Now, it's possible God would have made his plan come to fruition through either Jacob or Esau as well. So, but what Paul is saying is that he thinks Rebekah made the choice that God wanted her to make, which then goes along with this rabbinic tradition, right? That Isaac was going to make the wrong choice. Thanks, Mike. Have fun at church. So that it was not wrong for Rebekah to go against her husband. And kind of this goes with the idea, right, that patriarchy is not God's design. Patriarchy is the backdrop against which the Bible is written. Rebekah lived in a patriarchal time period. So yes, Isaac probably did not like this decision he made, because in his house, he is the king of his castle. And how dare his wife, who is his property, make a decision that goes against what he wants. But we know that God sees no difference between male and female. There's another verse about that, right? That before God, there is no male or female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, right? We are all the same. We are all humans made in God's image. And so Rebekah became a part of God's plan. And everything we know about Rebekah before this is that she is faithful, that she made this crazy decision to cross the world, to marry Isaac, because that's what God wanted her to do. So, sometimes we can think when we look at the Bible that the women in the Bible have no power, and that God never uses women. But then we can remember the story of Rebekah. Rebekah took the initiative, whether it was carrying water to camels or choosing which one of her sons would carry her father's legacy. She was a headstrong woman who did what she thought was best, not just for herself, but in God's eyes. And nothing after this chapter in the Bible would be the same without her decision. And nothing in the Bible condemns her for this decision, because God used her to change the course of history. So male or female, God uses us. And we are all part of his plan, right? All right, so that is the end of today's lesson. So let me stop the recording.